And last week we heard the story of Zacchaeus, who reminds us that when Jesus shows up in our lives, and he does, we can be faithful with much. Now this week I'd like to conclude this series by talking a little bit about being found faithful with all. And I'd like to do that by using an illustration about potlatch gatherings. Any of you happen to know what they are? Oh, good. I'll teach you something new then. For centuries, Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest would have potlatches, which were feasts usually thrown by the head of the household, and usually around this time of year, maybe as the harvest is being brought in, or maybe at another significant event in that family's life, like a birth or a wedding or a death. There would be dancing and a great celebration. And then the host would show his wealth and his power by doing something interesting. He would take everything that he owned and give it all away. It seems so impractical and counterintuitive to us in the modern world, and yet the tribes demonstrated a timeless truth. One's status, one's power is not raised by having more, but by sharing more. That's the lesson of the potlatch, that if you want more power, don't hoard it. Don't hoard your possessions. Share your gifts with others. And that's exactly what the nobleman does in today's gospel. He takes 10 minas, literally 3 months' worth of wages, and gives them to 10 of his servants. Now, that's quite a bit of money for a day laborer. And so he's entrusting a fair bit of wealth to them. And then he leaves town to go seek royal power. You might be thinking, well, that sounds very implausible. But actually, it was very common in the ancient Roman Empire for a king who otherwise would pay tribute to Rome to have his power ratified by the emperor. In fact, that's exactly what happened to Herod the Great's son, Archelaus, who was so disliked by the people he ruled that they sent a secret delegation behind him to tell Emperor Augustus that if he was made king, there would surely be a revolt. My point is this, that Jesus' audience would have known exactly what he was talking about in today's gospel, because it actually happened. But back to the parable. Jesus doesn't say exactly how the slaves used the minas that they were given, but I think he's trying to make the connection that everything that we have is first and foremost a gift from our King, a gift from God. It's a point that's underscored all the more when we consider that what immediately precedes this parable is the story of Zacchaeus that we heard last week. And when Zacchaeus welcomed Jesus into his home, the first thing that he does is make all of his possessions available to Jesus. He freely gives half of everything that he owns to the poor, and then he promises that if he's cheated anyone, that he would pay back 4 times that amount. I think taken together, these two stories in Luke 19 teach us that every way that we try and serve Christ is to recognize him as our King, to recognize that everything that we have is first and foremost a gift from God, and then to put those resources at God's disposal. We may not feel like we have much to give, but in one sense, that doesn't seem to matter. Because by the grace of God, our King can do things like take a gift of 5 loaves and 2 fish and multiply them into enough food to feed 5,000 people. Or if you want more modern day examples, more examples a little closer to home, think of the gifts that have been multiplied through this congregation over the past 50 years. Think of the thousands of meals that we have given away to individuals in need in Genesee County. Think about all of those who have been trained in the faith. Think of the Sunday school teachers who have passed on the faith from generation to generation. I was visiting a homebound member of this congregation about a week ago, and she was reminiscing about all of the Sunday school teachers that she taught, who are now themselves teaching Sunday school to their children. She even recalled an example of one Sunday school student who was the son of the pastor of the congregation, Michael Reinhardt, who is now the bishop of the Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast Synod. So somewhere, somehow, those little seeds that were planted did great works, and now he is helping lead congregations in Texas. Think even more recently than that about those little blueberries that we passed on over the past couple of weeks. I've seen a few of you post on Facebook some of the things that you've done to pass on gifts to those around you. There are countless other examples that we could name. But ultimately, they're all a reminder of how God can take even the littlest things and use them to multiply the blessings to others. I think that's how, at the end of the day, the servant with 1 pound was able to earn 10 more minas. Not by holding on to it, but by using it in the service of his master, and by being prepared to invest in other people's lives. He knew that what he had been given was a sacred trust and a privilege, and he did his best to be counted worthy of that trust. It leads to a couple of questions, some questions that I printed on the back of your bulletin if you want to take that home with you and think about them this week. That middle series of questions, I invite you to think, in what ways will you invest in the lives of others? And in what new ways might God be calling you to be generous in the year ahead? Maybe it's doing many of the same things you already are, but maybe now is a chance, as you think about your commitments and about your gifts of time and talent, to try something new in the coming weeks and months ahead. Of course, in the parable, there was that one slave who didn't make the best use of his mina. It was the one who decided that the best policy was not to lose it, but instead to keep it hidden in a piece of cloth. It was the slave for whom serving the king was not a joy and a privilege, but rather a chore and a burden. He probably saw what the others were doing with their mina and decided that it simply wasn't worth the risk. And what was the servant's excuse for hoarding that mina that he had been given? "I was afraid of you," he said. He thought his relationship with his master was based on fear and duty rather than on love and generosity. And that made all the difference in how he responded to his master. You know, that may be the greatest threat to us being good stewards. Not greed, but fear. Fear that no matter how much we have, we won't have enough. Fear that if we're not careful, we can lose what we have, even though it was never really ours to begin with. As Corrie ten Boom once said, "I've held many things in my hands, and I have lost them all. But whatever I have placed in God's hands, that I still possess." Indeed, every time we collect an offering here in worship, it's a witness to the entire world that we have put our trust in God, that our trust triumphs over our fear, and our generosity over greed. I know I haven't been here that long, and yet I've already seen how generous this congregation is. And I've seen possibilities for even more future ministries. Early next year, we'll engage in a strategic planning process that will help us focus on those ministries that we are already doing well and dream of ways that we can do even more as individuals and as a community of faith. Everyone gets a chance to participate in that. So look for more about that in January, all right? In the meanwhile, I realize that there's probably a little bit of that servant in each of us. The servant who hoarded his mina in fear. But the good news is that our King's love triumphs over our sense of fear, and his generosity triumphs over our sense of duty. Because like a chief throwing a potlatch, our King gave everything away on the cross. He was found faithful with all things, even his life, to show us exactly how much God treasures each one of us. Remember that each time it seems like a struggle to be faithful with much, or even with a little. And I'm confident that by the grace of God, you will be found faithful to the one who has been faithful in his love for us all. Amen.